When a bus broke down in a snowstorm, 19 strangers had nowhere to go. A quiet cafe owner opened her doors, with barely enough supplies to last a day. As the storm raged, the group held on with blankets, melted snow, and hope. Then a forgotten CB radio and an old soldier changed everything. What came through the mountains on day 3 shocked them all. Want to know what happened next? Stick with us, and don't forget to subscribe. It was late December 2004, and the cold in Spring Creek, Colorado had taken on the kind of weight that pressed into bone. The mountains stood silent, wrapped in clouds, and the wind threaded through the narrow canyon along Highway 285 like a warning. At the bend where the pines thinned and the rocks opened into a shallow clearing, Creekside Cafe sat low and squat, its green-painted trim chipped by seasons and time. A battered, hand-painted sign swung on its chain, creaking gently in the wind. Inside, the cafe held the familiar smell of old wood, brewed coffee, and oil from a griddle that had seen decades of bacon and eggs. Carolyn Moore moved slowly between the counter and the back room, her steps steady, her posture stiff from years of early mornings and lost sleep. For over 2 decades, she had run this place, first with her husband Tom, and after his sudden death, alone. Only her nephew Trevor came now, after school or during breaks, helping with the register or hauling boxes with quiet, awkward diligence. Business had slowed to a crawl over the past few winters. The timbered trucks that used to stop for coffee and pie now passed by without slowing, and tourists rarely braved the snow-season trails unless they were lost. Most days, the cafe served 2, maybe 3 tables. Locals mostly. Loggers, old men with nowhere else to sit, or the occasional hiker whose boots tracked pine needles across the worn tile floor. That day, the wind had picked up early. It howled past the window panes like something searching. The local radio murmured in the background from a dusty speaker near the cash register. Reports of an incoming blizzard grew more urgent by the hour. Carolyn turned up the heat and restocked the napkin holders, moving with the rhythm of someone who no longer expected surprises. Outside, the clouds thickened and the sky pressed low, smothering the last of the sunlight. By 5 o'clock, she had cleaned the counters twice and refilled the salt shakers out of habit. She unplugged the neon "open" sign from its socket and let it flicker once before fading. The last of the daylight had turned to ash on the snowbanks when she saw the headlights. They swung wide into the lot and slowed, tires sliding in slush. A long blue and white tour bus crept forward, its engine whining, then halted crookedly beside the gas pumps. It rocked gently, then stopped, half buried in fresh snow. The back tire spun for a moment, then gave up. Exhaust rose in slow white plumes. Carolyn stood behind the counter, still holding the plug in her hand, watching the fogged glass door. A moment passed, then another, and figures began to emerge. First one, then several more, bundled in scarves and winter coats, their shoulders hunched against the wind. She knew, even before the first knock sounded on the door, that this was not going to be a quiet night. The bus never restarted. Its engine sputtered twice more in the freezing air, then gave out with a heavy cough that echoed between the canyon walls. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a faded cap, stepped off and signaled for everyone to follow. Doors hissed open, and one by one the passengers descended into the cold. There were 19 of them in all. An elderly couple moved slowly, the man leaning heavily on a cane. A pregnant woman clutched a tote bag to her chest, her boots sinking into the snow. 2 teenagers, bundled in oversized hoodies, tried to shield a younger girl from the wind. And near the back, a small group of older men, quiet, upright, wearing jackets with patches from the armed forces, followed without complaint. Their faces were weathered by time and service, and their expressions betrayed no panic, only exhaustion. They had no signal. The canyon blocked reception, and the batteries in their phones had already been drained by the cold. The driver tried his radio again but received only static. Carolyn saw the hesitation in his posture, the quick glance toward the diner, and then she stepped aside, opening the door wider. Snow swirled in behind them as the first few passengers stepped inside. A gust of wind swept through the cafe, carrying with it a sense of finality. This was where the road ended, for now. The group filed in slowly, murmuring thanks, brushing off snow, stamping frozen boots against the mat by the door. Some lingered near the entrance, unsure of what to do next. Carolyn motioned them toward the booths, the counter stools, anywhere they could sit. The cafe, once empty and quiet, began to breathe again with movement. Trevor emerged from the back, his eyes wide at the sight of the crowd. Without being asked, he turned and hurried toward the storage shed out back, his boots leaving shallow tracks in the snow. Carolyn went straight to the kitchen. Supplies were low. She had known that when she came in this morning. One crate of potatoes, a few onions, 2 frozen chicken breasts, a half case of canned beans, and some boxed broth. Not enough to host a dinner, certainly not for 20 people. But she didn't pause. She filled the stock pot with water, peeled what she could, and started a soup. In the dining area, the new arrivals settled into corners and empty booths. Some sat silently, rubbing their hands together, watching the fog crawl across the windows. Others leaned against one another for warmth. The pregnant woman reclined carefully in a corner booth, while the older men helped unroll a jacket beneath her back. The teenagers passed a pack of gum between them wordlessly. Carolyn brewed coffee in small batches, pouring it into chipped mugs and sliding them down the counter. She opened the cabinet near the back of the kitchen, where old flannel blankets and mismatched thermoses had been stored for years. She laid them out on the tables like offerings, letting people take what they needed. Trevor returned a few minutes later, dragging a dusty space heater from the shed. He plugged it into the wall near the center of the cafe, and the coils inside began to glow dim orange. The hum of the generator outside picked up, struggling against the cold, but holding. The heater's warmth wasn't much, but it was enough to soften the air, enough to make the room feel less like a place to wait and more like a place to endure. As the storm thickened outside, the cafe became something else. Less a business, more a refuge. The windows fogged up with breath, the tables cluttered with coats and scarves and paper cups. No one knew how long they would be there, but for that moment, no one asked. They simply sat and thawed and waited. Evening settled slowly over the cafe, turning the windows into dim mirrors and the snow outside into a shifting wall of silence. The storm continued, relentless and thick, but inside Creekside Cafe, something subtle began to change. The cold no longer sat between people like a wall. Instead, it seemed to draw them closer, pressing strangers into quiet proximity and eventually, shared space. Conversations began in murmurs, soft, cautious, like stones dropped into still water. A few words between the 2 teenage boys turned into a low chuckle. A woman helped the older man with the cane remove his coat. The veteran with the sun-weathered face, who had sat alone at first with his arms crossed over his chest, began to speak. His name was Melvin, and though his voice cracked from age, it carried weight. He spoke not of battles or medals, but of a winter in Korea, of a night so cold he feared sleep would steal his breath. His story unfolded slowly, marked by pauses that the others did not interrupt. Across from him, a young woman with windburned cheeks introduced herself as Haley. She had been working tables in a Denver diner that closed 2 months ago. Since then, she'd been trying to find her way back to her parents in New Mexico, traveling by bus, hoping not to run out of money before she made it home. Her voice faltered when she mentioned the eviction notice she had folded into her backpack, but no one pressed her for details. No one needed to. As more stories were shared, a rhythm emerged, not of excitement or drama, but of quiet lives lived fully in the shadows of larger events. One man spoke of losing his dog the week before. Another recounted a Christmas spent alone on the road. A teenage girl described a song her grandmother used to hum during thunderstorms. The cafe became a chapel of memory, the scent of soup and coffee hanging in the air like incense. Carolyn moved through the space with practiced steps, refilling mugs and ladling out broth. She didn't speak much. Her presence was measured, steady, something people leaned into without realizing. When the pregnant girl reached out and touched her hand in thanks, tears pricked behind Carolyn's eyes, but she only nodded and went back to the kitchen. Trevor carried blankets from the storeroom in stacks, laying them over shoulders, offering them to outstretched hands. Someone clapped him gently on the back. For the first time, he didn't shrink from it. His chest rose with something he hadn't felt in months, purpose, however small. The heater pulsed softly in the corner, its coils dim but loyal. People huddled closer to it, but not out of desperation anymore. There was warmth now and more than the air. The cafe glowed in the half-light, yellow from the fixtures overhead, orange from the flicker of the stove. The snowstorm continued to scream through the mountains, but it felt farther away now, like a story from a different town. In the fading light, faces turned toward each other instead of the door. The fear of waiting had given way to something slower, older, and almost sacred, the quiet comfort of simply being together. By morning, the storm had not relented, but the silence on the highway and the dead static on every frequency made one thing clear. Help would not arrive for at least another day. Snow had packed itself high against the doors and windows, and the drifting made it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. The cafe had become a snowbound island, and inside, the slow reality of dwindling resources settled like dust. The pantry was almost bare. Carolyn stood before the open cabinet and counted what remained with tired eyes. 2 loaves of bread, hard at the edges, half a sack of flour, a few cans of corn, some powdered milk, a tin of peaches. She ran her fingers along the labels, mentally dividing portions. There was no hesitation in her hands. She sliced the bread into thin pieces and toasted them over the gas flame, turning each one with a fork. The griddle had gone cold long ago. The generator outside stuttered every 20 minutes, coughing into silence before rumbling back to life in a weakened pulse. The pipes in the kitchen had frozen overnight. Water no longer ran from the taps. Carolyn filled a stock pot with packed snow and set it over the flame, watching it melt slowly. The steam rose sluggishly, fogging the window above the sink. She scooped the warm water into a pitcher and set it on the counter, offering it to anyone who wanted to wash their hands or wipe their face. Trevor hunched near the back of the cafe with the battery-powered radio cradled in his lap, slowly twisting the dial in search of anything, a voice, a weather report, even a beacon tone. But all he found was static, a ceaseless whisper that filled the room with a reminder of how far they were from help. Still, he kept trying, his eyes locked in quiet determination. Outside, a few of the men had taken up shovels found in the storage shed. They cleared a narrow path around the building, not because it would matter immediately, but because movement offered purpose. Their figures appeared and vanished in the white blur beyond the fogged windows, silhouettes against a world made shapeless by snow. Inside, people turned to tasks that required no instruction. Someone used fabric scraps from a backpack to sew small cushions. Another guest examined a broken chair, tightening its legs with a pocket tool. They passed time not in waiting, but in creating small usefulness. Carolyn emerged from the back with an old board game, its box faded and corners taped. It had belonged to her and Tom, something they used to play during long winters when the cafe had fewer customers and longer nights. She laid it on the central table, opened the pieces, and gestured quietly for others to join. At first, only a few approached. Then laughter bubbled up, tentative, brittle, but real. Someone made a joke about the missing game tokens. Another offered buttons as substitutes. The moment was not grand, but it was human. It was the sound of people remembering they were still more than passengers in a storm. The cafe remained cold in places, the heater fighting an uphill battle, but the warmth came from elsewhere, from shared glances, from offered mittens, from the way no one sat entirely alone anymore. For a little while they smiled, not because the danger had passed, but because they had learned to carry it together. On the third morning, just as the storm began to lose its grip on the mountains, the first sounds came. Not wind or footsteps, but engines. Deep, low rumbling from beyond the snow-packed hills. At first it was difficult to tell whether it was real or imagined, a trick of tired minds. But then, through the thick white haze outside the cafe windows, shapes emerged. Dark, boxy silhouettes cutting slowly through the drifted road. 4 military jeeps rolled into the clearing, their tires grinding against ice and compacted snow. Emblems of the National Guard were stamped on their doors, dusted white by the storm. Soldiers stepped out, bundled in heavy coats and goggles, their boots crunching across the packed snow. A rush of motion followed as they approached the diner, voices muffled by scarves and radios. Inside the cafe, movement slowed. Faces turned toward the windows. People stood from their places at the booths, watching in disbelief as uniforms crossed the threshold. No one spoke, but the air shifted. Relief mingled with disbelief. Hope mingled with exhaustion. It wasn't a coincidence. One of the veterans, an older man with a quiet presence, had written a message by flashlight 2 nights earlier, his handwriting slow and precise. He had slipped the note into a waterproof sleeve and used a satellite radio stashed at the bottom of his rucksack to transmit a single request for help. The signal had bounced through storm-clogged airwaves and eventually reached a Veterans Affairs contact, who pushed it forward until it landed on the desk of someone who knew exactly where Spring Creek was. The soldiers had not arrived empty-handed. They carried boxes sealed with red tape, emergency meals, bottled water, first aid kits, and fresh medical supplies. One of them directed the placement of a portable generator, its cables already coiled and marked. Another handed out thick blankets to shivering shoulders. In a matter of minutes, the cafe, still warm with human resilience, filled with heat, energy, and movement. The outside world, once silent, had finally spoken back. One officer paused as he stepped inside and looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the booths, the faces. Then he saw the faded sign behind the counter. The same hand-painted name, the same elk curled in red script. He smiled faintly. Years ago, as a young recruit, he had stopped here for a sandwich on a long winter night. He remembered the smell of cinnamon and the voice of the woman behind the counter. Now he approached that same counter where Carolyn stood behind a row of empty mugs. Without a word, he handed her a white envelope. Inside was a single page, thick with official stationery and the signature of the state governor. It carried words of recognition, not for heroism in the field, but for compassion in the quiet places, for transforming an aging roadside cafe into a haven when it was needed most. Carolyn held the envelope in both hands, her expression unreadable. Around her, people whispered, their eyes following the soldiers, their shoulders easing just slightly. But no one rushed to leave. The buses weren't yet running. The roads would take hours to clear. And more than that, something had been built within those snow-covered walls that wasn't ready to be dismantled. That night, everyone stayed once more. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. Blankets were shared. Stories resumed. And for the first time in 3 days, the heater wasn't the only thing humming. The world had found them again. But inside the cafe, time held still a little longer. By early spring, the last of the snow had melted into the creeks and gullies, leaving behind damp earth and the sharp green promise of renewal. The road outside the cafe, once silent and buried, now hummed again with traffic. Delivery trucks, pickups, and occasional motorcycles heading up into the mountains. Spring Creek, though small and weathered, began to stir with its usual quiet rhythm. From the outside, Creekside Cafe looked just as it always had. The sign still creaked gently on its chain, the paint still peeled at the corners, and the windows still bore the faint outline of steam from the morning rush. But inside, the place had changed, subtly, completely. There was something different in the air now. Something that lingered long after the coffee had been poured and the plates cleared. On one wall, beside the booth where the pregnant woman had rested during the storm, there now hung a framed collection of photographs. Some were grainy, taken with disposable cameras or old phones, but each captured a fragment of that 3-day storm. Smiling faces wrapped in blankets, children asleep under jackets, soldiers standing in the doorway, steam rising from their coats. Surrounding the photos were handwritten notes, thank you letters, postcards, and crayon drawings mailed from places as far as Oregon and Tennessee. One envelope had arrived with no return address, only the words, "To the woman who stayed," scrawled in faded ink. Carolyn kept them all. She had cleared a small section of shelving near the counter and labeled it quietly, the winter room. Visitors paused there, sometimes with quiet reverence, sometimes with curious disbelief. The storm had left its mark not in damage, but in memory. Trevor had never left. What began as a favor to family had become something rooted. He helped with the kitchen now, managed supply runs, and learned how to fix the coffee machine without being asked. Customers recognized him, asked for him by name. He had grown into the place, no longer the uncertain teenager, but a steady presence at Carolyn's side. They worked in unspoken rhythm, like pages of the same book turned one after another. People who had once waited out a blizzard in that cafe often came back. Veterans returned on long drives through the state, dropping off tins of cookies or warm notes in envelopes. A college student once arrived with a camera crew to film a project on kindness. One family sent a quilt stitched with every name they remembered from those 3 frozen days. Then one morning, just as the sky began to shift from gray to gold, a bus pulled into the lot. It was not the same bus, but its tires hissed the same way over the gravel. The doors opened and strangers stepped off. Tired, travel-worn, faces lined with quiet fatigue. They looked around, unsure of where they had stopped, scanning the cafe with that same mix of hesitation and hope. Carolyn watched from behind the counter. She saw the way their shoulders sagged, the way one of them clutched a folded map, the way another rubbed warmth into their hands. She didn't ask questions. She turned on the coffee pot, filled the old tin kettle, and reached up to straighten the sign on the front door. When they came inside, the warmth was already there, waiting, ready. And Carolyn, who had once opened her doors without expecting anything in return, knew exactly what to do. Because once you've given shelter to the lost, you begin to see them everywhere. And once you've built a place that held people through a storm, you no longer need a storm to keep it full.